Welcome back to Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are going to talk about feminist ethics. Now, right off the bat, I want to emphasize that we're talking about feminist ethics, right? And so we're talking about various philosophical positions that fall under the heading of, kind of broadly speaking, feminist ethics, but also is contrasted with what we tend to think about as feminism in kind of a popular culture sense. Oftentimes, when we think about feminism, we're thinking about a social movement, women's lib, and something concerned about equal rights for women or other genders, and so on and so forth. Now, that is definitely relevant to feminist ethics, but for the purpose of this course and the articles we'll be reading, we're really looking at um, philosophical positions that are all actually pretty different, but they tend to consider issues like gender and and other social factors and how they contribute to our ethical outlook, right? And in particular, how they contribute to the ethical outlook of the people who are advancing ethical theories, right? And so the concern is really that, and our concern here will be with looking at feminist ethics as a critique of the other ethical theories we've looked at, right? So a critique of Kantian ethics, a critique of Mill's utilitarianism, a critique of Aristotelian virtue ethics, right? And the critique will be basically that in various ways they overlook lots of important ethical issues, and they overlook all kinds of important ethical values, and they tend to assume a fairly narrow view of moral agency, meaning the person who's the kind of moral deliberator and actor, right? And also, a fairly narrow view of what ethical values are important to us. One analogy, I think sometimes it's easy to get kind of blinded by the term feminism in a certain sense. People hear certain things, there's certain connotations. Again, this is moving away from feminism as a popular or pop culture kind of a phenomenon to more of a camp of philosophical positions. One way to really help get a handle on where the course is moving and looking at feminist ethics is to kind of make an analogy. So consider that I am a psychologist and I'm doing some research on the effects of trauma, right? And I tell you that I've made all these conclusions about the way trauma affects us neurologically and the way trauma affects us behaviorally. And the reason why I've made all these conclusions is because I've done a study on over 200 subjects about how they dealt with trauma in various ways. And you say, oh, well, that's so interesting. Who were your subjects? And I say they were all people ages 5 to 12, right? Um, and at that point, you'd probably stop and say, well, is this on child psychology? And I say, no, this is just about trauma in general. And you might stop me there and say, well, did you think that all your subjects are children? They're all under the age of 12. Doesn't that kind of affect the conclusions you draw? And if I didn't see what I was doing as somehow very focused on a particular age group, a particular people at a particular stage in their life, you would think, well, there's nothing wrong with my research. Exactly. It's just that I need to recognize that it's pretty narrow, right? And the conclusions I draw should not be conclusions about the way everyone acts in light of trauma, right? It should be really relegated to this idea of childhood trauma, right? There's a similar kind of thing going on with a lot of critiques in terms of feminist ethics that when we look at something like these three different points that we'll look at in terms of authorship feminism, issue feminism, and so on, is that we're making a lot of generalizations based on the views of particular people, right? Particularly, usually white men that are of a particular social status, right? All the people we've read, Kant, Mill, there's other authors that we didn't talk about, Hume. I mean, if you look through the history of philosophy and all the major works on ethics, they're all, most of them, the great majority are written by men. And the idea is that this skews our sense of what ethics is. And in particular, it skews it because a lot of these ethical theories claim to be universal in scope, right? Kant is very clear about this. Mill is clear about this. Aristotle is clear about this. Even Plato. And and if you claim that your theory is supposed to be universal in scope, apply to all rational beings or all human beings or something like that, it seems like you should really consider different ways of life, different cultures, and different genders, and different people who come from different social classes, all these kinds of things, right? And a lot of the critique of feminist ethics, focuses on this, that a lot of things are missing, right? So in this particular article, it's a really broad overview of what feminist ethics looks like, and they name three different approaches that are kind of different kinds of critiques of traditional ethics. And the first one is issue feminism, right? And this is the idea that in the history of ethics, there's been a failure to talk about issues that are particularly prevalent in the lives of women. But I think also a look at this is that there's a lot of missing issues that are very, very morally charged for us, right? So some of the issues that I kind of raise in my notes are that, we haven't given a lot of consideration to the ethical obligation you have to your family, right? We haven't really talked about relationships. We haven't talked about children. And that is one that I think particularly stands out because whatever moral situation you have, if you add kids to the picture, it becomes more ethically charged, right? At least from an emotive standpoint, right? If one person hits another person, that's bad. If one person hits a child, it's worse, right? I mean, that's just the way we tend to evaluate it. And if you think about that, then you wonder, well, why haven't we really talked about that? Aristotle does to a certain extent, right, with moral education and this idea. But, childbirth is another huge issue that is really, really, really ethically loaded, and that is fairly omitted from history of ethics. Also, issues about domestic violence, which is also very complex. Also, the idea of the emotions in general. Kant has a view that really we should not be pushed around by the emotions at all. And you might wonder, well, under based on what should we kind of reject the emotions, right? Why should we reject self-interest and all kinds of other things? So there's lots of issues that have a lot of moral import and are very controversial to us, or are important to us in our daily lives that are really not topic for discussion in a lot of ethical theories. And so one kind of feminist critique here is, why aren't we talking about this stuff? On what basis aren't we talking about this stuff? And one reason to think about that is kind of turn to the second point here, which is authorship feminism, right? Or at least the idea that a lot of the vast majority of these authors are not women and haven't had to deal, at least especially in the 1800s, didn't deal with a lot of the aspects of domestic life, right? So the second point, authorship feminism, really draws attention to this idea that there are no women authors in the history of thought. Now, there are some, for sure, but you definitely have to look, and they're not as widely known or talked about, right? And I mentioned this in the critical question, but it's just something that that lack of perspective, you have to wonder, right, why that is, and how it could be thought that it doesn't shape our ethical outlook, right? The fact that all the authors can come from a particular class and a particular gender, right? And so, but in general, authorship feminism is really motivated by the idea of to go back and look at women thinkers in the history of thought and in contemporary thought, and get the perspective of someone who has that experience, right? And this is, I mean, definitely in the history of thought. Some students point out that, times were different 100, 200, 500 years ago, for sure. However, this is still pretty prevalent. I add some numbers from the APA, the American Philosophical Association, that 25% of philosophy professors are women. I think it might be up to 30% now. And then this gets narrower as the numbers go down, as you kind of go higher up in the ranks, right? Like only 15% of authors in top tier journals, philosophy journals, are women, and there's more women who major in philosophy as an undergrad, less in graduate school, less that are PhDs, and so on and so forth. And the percentage keeps going down, and you might wonder, why this is still the case, right? And I think some thinkers think that authorship feminism is kind of the way to go, that you have more women authors, than more women see themselves as philosophers, and so on and so forth. So that's another kind of approach to feminist ethics, is to just talk about women authors very simply. And then the third one is the one that we will kind of be focused on more, which is this postmodern feminism, right? And this is the idea that the assumption of a male point of view is really the paradigm of an ethical subject or a moral agent, right? So when it comes to how this works, the idea is that, if you have all these male authors and you look at the kinds of values that are kind of paradigm importance in the history of thought, that is very much shaped by the fact that those authors are men. So some values that are really prevalent are things like independence. Violence is oftentimes sanctioned. It's really big value on autonomy. If you think about things like Mill's sacrifice of the few for the greater good, and these kinds of things, you might think that those values really are kind of focused on the kind of male experience of the world, right? Whereas other values are not so much emphasized, things like cooperation, and nonviolent engagement with others, discussion, compromise, all kinds of other things. And not to say that those values are necessarily ones that women identify with, but nonetheless, they are values that are omitted, right? And that are not emphasized. And so one might think that, like, really the social status of men throughout history, and particularly the men that were able to write philosophy, right, really shaped the way they thought of a moral agent, right? One really good example of this is to think about Kant's view of a moral agent in the categorical imperative, right? First of all, Kant's categorical imperative is very strict, right? It's not, it's very black and white. It's absolute in the way that he puts it forth. But also, to understand something like the categorical imperative requires someone to really have kind of full, what would you say, full use of their cognitive capacities, right? And one thing that, from the Kantian moral agent does not have time or room for is a lot of things that we tend to be bombarded with as human beings, right? Emotions, sickness, kids really can't understand the categorical imperative. If someone's suffering from dementia, right, they're not going to be able to really reason in that way. Same thing with utilitarian calculus. And so it really, some argue that it presupposes that a person is in some sense in an ideal situation in their life. They have lots of time to think about things, weigh the pros and cons, to investigate these kinds of moral dilemmas before they act. And that's not the case for a lot of people, right? And so anyways, so this is kind of like the gist of postmodern feminism, right? And one thing to kind of seal this up a little bit is to think about, this postmodern feminist critique is really about poking at the underlying assumptions of some of these traditional moral theories, right? And you see this in the moral theories themselves, in the traditional moral theories themselves. So a good example of this is that if, a critique of something like Kant and Mill, deontology and consequentialism, that a virtue ethicist might point out is that, and that we've already talked about, is that, Kant and Mill focus on actions and whether actions are right or wrong, right? And a virtue ethicist kind of undercuts that whole idea and says, no, we shouldn't be talking about actions in isolation. We should be talking about the whole person, right? And so the virtue ethicist is concerned with ethics in terms of being a good person, not necessarily doing the right thing in a particular situation, right? So, and so it's a shift in paradigm, right? And the feminist critiques are similar in that respect, right? They want to look at the underlying assumptions, the things that Kant and Mill are just not talking about, but are entailed by their approaches. So, yeah. And so this is just an introductory kind of module, and then in the next couple, we will start to look at some more determinate views that kind of fall under the broad heading of feminist ethics. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching.